My husband's phone rang as I stood at the kitchen counter, buttering toast and humming the tune he always sang in the shower. I picked it up without thinking. I'd answered hundreds of his work calls over the years. The caller ID said, "Office," and I expected Patricia's usual chipper tone or maybe Gary's familiar baritone. Instead, a soft, breathy voice said, "You left your underwear here again." My hand froze mid-motion as silence swallowed the room. Before I continue narrating the story of Angela Mitchell, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. I said nothing, trying to process what I'd just heard. She giggled, the sound sharp and intimate, like she was sharing an inside joke with someone she loved. "I can't stop thinking about you," the voice whispered, thick with warmth and desire. "Last night was unforgettable." I ended the call with shaking fingers, like I'd touched something poisonous. The air in the kitchen shifted, becoming heavy and sour despite the early sunlight streaming through the bay windows. Kevin's off-key singing echoed from the master bathroom upstairs, cheerful and oblivious. I stared down at the phone in my hand, now resting on the granite countertop like evidence at a crime scene. That voice, it wasn't a stranger. It was Denise Hartwell, the woman I'd once called my friend. Denise, Gary Hartwell's wife, the same woman who'd sat beside me at corporate dinners, complimenting my dresses and asking about my freelance graphic design work. Her southern drawl was unmistakable, a gentle lull I used to find charming. Now it cut like a blade, slicing through every shared memory. She'd giggled across candlelit tables and holiday gatherings, while stealing glances at my husband. The realization settled in my chest like a stone. I looked around our kitchen, the polished copper pots Kevin had insisted on, the custom backsplash we'd argued over for months. Every inch had been carefully curated over years of shared dreams. Suddenly, it felt like a set, a backdrop for a play in which I'd been cast as the fool. I reached for the sink, turned on the water, and rinsed my hands as if that would cleanse me of what I'd just heard. But I couldn't rinse away betrayal. Our Tuesday morning routine played out like always. Kevin emerged from his shower at 7:30 sharp, humming and freshly shaven. His towel was slung low around his hips as he reached for the blue dress shirt I'd picked up from the dry cleaner the day before. "Who was on the phone?" he asked, toweling his hair, his smile bright and easy. "Wrong number," I said, forcing my voice into casualness. "Some woman looking for her husband's office." The irony was almost too perfect. Some woman looking for her husband. Kevin kissed my cheek and reached for the espresso machine, oblivious to the lie nesting just beneath my smile. He poured his coffee and took a sip, sighing with satisfaction like nothing had changed. And in that moment, I realized I was married to a stranger. Or worse, a stranger wearing my husband's face. As he sat at the island reading the news aloud, I studied him in silence. His leaner frame, the subtle shift in confidence, the sleek black cologne bottle that had quietly replaced the drugstore aftershave on his vanity. Gift from a client, he'd said months ago. Which client, I'd wondered then. Now I wondered who he was trying to impress. The gym membership card I'd found in his wallet suddenly made sense. Kevin had never cared about fitness before. He preferred books to barbells, red wine to reps. But over the last few months, he'd transformed, more definition in his arms, broader shoulders, tighter abs. "You look good," I murmured as he adjusted his tie. "Must be those early workouts." He smiled, pleased with himself, and told me he had a big meeting with Gary about the Peterson account, followed by a client dinner. "Another one?" I asked, careful to sound merely curious. He nodded, already distracted by his phone. I wondered how many of those dinners were with Denise. I wondered how long they'd been lying to me. After he left, the house felt cavernous and too quiet. The breakfast dishes sat untouched on the table, toast cooling and eggs congealing on the plate. I sat at the table, staring at the chair Kevin had just vacated. The sunlight was too harsh now, illuminating cracks in the walls I hadn't noticed before. Or maybe they'd always been there. I drifted into the living room and stood before the fireplace mantel, where framed memories smiled back at me. Vacations, anniversaries, holidays. One photo in particular caught my eye. Kevin and I on the beach in Santorini, taken just 3 months ago. His arm was wrapped around me, our foreheads touching as the sunset blazed behind us. Had he already been with her then? Had that smile been real? The questions came like a flood. How many lies had he told? How many dinners were actually trysts? How often had Denise sat across from me, laughing, while imagining my husband in her bed? I wrapped my arms around myself as nausea twisted in my stomach. The woman I'd thought was my friend had been my rival all along. I walked into the master bedroom and sat on the edge of our king-sized bed. Kevin's cologne still lingered in the air, rich, musky, foreign. I stared at his nightstand, where his phone usually charged, now empty, like the space beside me. My fingers itched to search it, but I knew he'd changed his passcode recently. I'd noticed it and thought nothing of it. I opened our closet and stared at his neatly arranged suits, the ones I dry cleaned and organized weekly. I thought about the ties he wore for special meetings, the pocket squares I ironed for him with care. Every detail of our lives had been touched by me. And yet, he'd shared the most intimate parts of himself with someone else, someone I'd trusted. Back downstairs, I made a second cup of coffee, just to keep my hands busy. I texted Emma, my sister, asking if she could talk later. I needed a voice from home, someone who remembered me before this carefully curated life. Before Kevin and the mortgage and the dinner parties. Before Denise. The text bubble blinked for a moment, then disappeared. Emma was probably teaching. She always got back to me in the evenings. I sat on the couch and stared at the television, not even bothering to turn it on. My mind was running too fast for any distraction to catch up. The betrayal wasn't just Kevin's. It was Denise's too. Her soft compliments, her interest in my work, her invitations to couples retreats and wine tastings. She had been gathering intelligence. Every detail I'd shared about Kevin's schedule, his habits, his moods. I'd handed her a blueprint for the affair. I'd built their affair without even knowing it. The day passed in a blur, every minute stretching longer than the last. I found myself folding laundry with robotic precision, pausing only when I came across one of Kevin's workout shirts. It smelled like expensive detergent and unfamiliar cologne, a stark reminder of how much he'd changed without explanation. My hands trembled as I set it aside, unwilling to press it close to my chest like I used to. The betrayal hadn't just been emotional. It had crept into the fabric of our home, quiet and invasive. When Emma finally called back that evening, her voice was cheerful and unaware. "Hey sis, everything okay? You sounded weird earlier." I opened my mouth to respond, but found myself unable to form words that made sense. How could I explain that my world had cracked open from a single whispered sentence on a phone call I shouldn't have answered? "I just needed to hear your voice," I managed, voice barely above a whisper. Emma paused, sensing the shift immediately, her tone softening. "Angie, what's going on?" she asked. I debated telling her everything right then, the recording in my mind playing Denise's voice on loop. But something inside me hesitated, not out of fear, but strategy. I needed to be sure before I dragged anyone else into this. "I think Kevin's hiding something," I said instead. There was a silence on the other end, thick and uneasy. "What kind of something?" Emma asked cautiously. I could hear the rustling of paper, the shifting of her weight as if bracing for impact. "Another woman?" I didn't answer directly, but the breath I released said more than words ever could. Emma cursed under her breath, a rare slip for her. "You need proof," she said finally, her voice firm. "Hard proof. Otherwise, he'll just deny it and twist it back on you." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I know," I whispered, already imagining the evidence I'd need. But what I had was stronger than suspicion. It was Denise's voice, etched into memory. That night, Kevin came home late, like he'd said he would. He smelled like aftershave and steakhouse, his tie loosened just enough to look deliberately casual. "Dinner went great," he announced as he stepped into the kitchen, dropping his briefcase by the door. "Morrison Industries is definitely interested. We could be looking at a huge contract." I smiled and nodded, watching him with the eyes of someone who now saw past the performance. He opened the fridge and pulled out a bottle of white wine, pouring 2 glasses without asking. "Thought we could celebrate," he said, handing me one with his usual crooked grin. I raised it with him and took a sip, the taste suddenly bitter. I wondered if Denise had shared the same vintage just hours earlier. We sat in the living room, pretending everything was normal. Kevin leaned back against the couch cushions, scrolling through his phone while I curled my legs beneath me. "You were quiet earlier," he said without looking up. "Everything okay?" I nodded, sipping slowly, not trusting myself to speak without unraveling. The next morning, I rose before him, slipping out of bed as quietly as I could. I padded into the kitchen and opened his laptop, the silver one he always left charging overnight. He'd recently added a password, claiming it was part of the company's new security protocol. But Kevin had always been sentimental when it came to passwords. I typed in our anniversary, June 150, 2004. The login screen disappeared, replaced by his cluttered desktop. My heart pounded as I opened the browser and pulled up his history. Scrolling through searches and bookmarked sites, most looked innocent. News, stocks, sports. But then I found a folder on the desktop labeled Invoices. I clicked it open and stared. Boutique hotels, spa treatments, and luxury dinners, all booked for two. One email stood out, marked with a red flag and saved under a hidden subfolder labeled Admin. It was a reservation confirmation for a weekend getaway, Kevin Mitchell and guest, with a suite featuring a hot tub and ocean view. The date matched one of his recent business trips. My stomach turned as I imagined Denise in that suite, draped in the robe he always bragged about loving. My fingers hovered over the print option, but instead, I took screenshots. I transferred the files to a flash drive and hid it in the false bottom of my jewelry box. Kevin stirred upstairs, and I quickly shut down the laptop, returning to the kitchen like nothing had happened. The espresso machine hissed to life, steam curling into the air as I ground the beans. "You're up early," Kevin said as he walked in, still in pajamas. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, handing him his favorite mug. He kissed my cheek and took a sip, humming again like he did every morning. The sound grated now, a performance he didn't realize I'd stopped applauding. "Denise texted me," he said offhandedly, checking his phone. "Said she found a new spot for our double date." I smiled, barely. Looking forward to it, I lied. He headed to the shower, and I waited until the water started before returning to the bedroom. I slid open his closet drawer and found what I was looking for, his gym bag. Inside was a towel, some protein bars, and a pair of running shoes. Nothing unusual until I checked the side pocket. A small receipt from a jewelry store dated 2 weeks ago. The item listed, a diamond pendant necklace, engraved with initials that weren't mine. My breath caught as I stared at the initials. D.H. Denise Hartwell. The receipt crumpled in my fist as I heard the water shut off upstairs. I shoved the bag back together and returned to the kitchen. When Kevin came down dressed and refreshed, he asked if I'd seen his black tie. "Top drawer," I said, already knowing it was hanging in the closet where I'd left it yesterday. He nodded, grabbed it, and flashed me another of his careless smiles. I watched him finish getting ready and walk out the door with a cheerful wave. As his car disappeared down the street, I turned and locked the front door behind him, then leaned against it, breathless. I called Emma before I could change my mind. "You were right," I said, skipping any greeting. "I have proof." Her breath caught audibly on the other end. "Tell me everything," she said. I sat at the breakfast nook while Emma listened in stunned silence, her coffee growing cold on the other end of the line. "He booked hotel rooms for two," I said, forcing the words out past the lump in my throat. "Dinner reservations, jewelry with her initials. It's not speculation anymore." Emma didn't speak for several seconds, and I imagined her staring blankly at her kitchen wall, struggling to absorb the betrayal. "You need to protect yourself, Angie," she said finally, her voice firm but soft. "Start by moving your money," Emma advised, and I scribbled notes with the mechanical clarity of someone making a grocery list. She reminded me about my separate freelance account, the one I barely touched since Kevin insisted on combining our finances. "He doesn't have access to that one, right?" she asked. "Only me," I replied, suddenly grateful for my past stubbornness. "Then move what you can and stop using the joint cards." That afternoon, I opened my laptop with trembling hands and logged into our shared bank account. The numbers stared back at me, healthy, impressive even, but I no longer trusted them. Kevin handled most of our finances under the guise of being more detail-oriented. Now, I saw it for what it was: control. I transferred my recent freelance earnings into my separate account and changed the password. Next, I called the bank and requested alerts for all withdrawals over $50. The woman on the line sounded polite but distracted, unaware that she was speaking to someone quietly unraveling her marriage. "Would you like to set a spending limit on the shared credit card?" she asked. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "200. I want to be notified every time it's used." After hanging up, I sat in silence, my fingers still curled around the phone. The room felt too quiet again, like the walls were waiting for me to finally fall apart. But I didn't. I couldn't. There was too much left to do. The next time Kevin called to say he'd be late due to a client dinner, I didn't respond. Instead, I opened the email I'd drafted earlier with the hotel confirmation attached and added the receipt from the jewelry store. I addressed it to myself, blind copying Emma and changing the subject line to "Insurance do not delete." Just having it there made me feel steadier, as if documenting his betrayal gave me some kind of control. I hit send. I started keeping a notebook in my bedside table. A simple black leather one Kevin had given me last Christmas. Each entry detailed dates, times, conversations, receipts, and anything else that might matter. I wrote down everything, even the way he smiled when he mentioned Denise's name, or how his eyes darted away when I asked about his calendar. If he ever tried to lie again, I'd be ready. I wasn't planning revenge. I was building a record. 2 days later, I sat across from Denise at a sleek little cafe she'd suggested for our girl time. She wore oversized sunglasses and a designer trench coat, like a woman who lived in a magazine. "I've missed this," she said, sipping from a crystal glass of water with lemon. "We don't spend enough time, just the two of us." I smiled and nodded, even as bile churned in my stomach. I wore the same sapphire earrings she'd complimented at the lake house party last fall. They were a gift from Kevin, now tainted, but still beautiful. Denise leaned forward, her voice softening. "Is everything okay with you two?" she asked. "You just seem a little off lately." I blinked at her, marveling at how bold she was to play concerned friend. "We're good," I said with a smile that felt paper-thin. "Kevin's been busy, but that's nothing new." Her lips curled slightly, as if she found that answer amusing. Men like Kevin never really slow down, do they? I kept my tone light, deflecting every question with carefully rehearsed answers. "He's been more into fitness lately," I said, watching her closely. "I think it's been good for him. You know how men are when they hit their 40s? Suddenly they care about abs and heart rate monitors." She laughed, her smile too wide. "Maybe I should send Gary to the gym." We parted with air kisses and empty promises to plan a couple spa days soon. I watched her walk away, graceful as ever, and wondered how many other women she'd lied to with that same smile. Her scent lingered in the air, jasmine and something expensive. I waited until she turned the corner before I exhaled. I didn't know what was worse, that she'd betrayed me or that she was so comfortable doing it. That night, Kevin came home earlier than usual, his tie already loosened and his hair slightly tousled. "Gary canceled dinner," he said, dropping his keys in the bowl by the door. "Something came up at work." I forced a smile and reached for the bottle of wine I'd opened an hour earlier. "That's too bad. I was looking forward to a quiet night." He poured us both a glass, clearly pleased by the unexpected domesticity. "I don't say this enough," he said, holding his glass toward mine, "but I appreciate everything you do. I know I've been distracted lately." I clinked glasses with him and swallowed the bitterness behind my teeth. We sat on the couch and watched a movie he picked, something lighthearted and forgettable. I leaned into him like I always did, memorizing the way his arm curled around my shoulders. My eyes stayed fixed on the screen, but my mind wandered to the emails, the receipts, the lies. I didn't feel anything anymore. Not love, not hate, just numb calculation. Emma called the next morning with an edge in her voice I hadn't heard before. "Melissa, my friend at Hartwell's accounting department has been asking around," she said. She thinks something shady's happening with company expenses. I straightened in my chair, suddenly alert. What kind of shady? I asked. Emma paused, her voice lower now. Kevin's name came up. I sat perfectly still, my pen hovering above the grocery list I'd been pretending to make. She didn't want to say much, just that he's authorizing a lot of vendor payments, consulting fees, travel expenses, big-ticket items with vague descriptions. My pulse raced. Kevin had access to corporate funds. If he was using them to finance his affair, it wasn't just adultery, it was theft. She said she'd dig around. Emma continued, her tone cautious. But you need to be careful. If this gets out too fast, he could bury the evidence. I nodded, swallowing the fear that rose in my throat. I wasn't just dealing with a cheating husband. I might be married to a criminal. Emma's warning clung to me like fog as I stood in the middle of our kitchen, still holding the phone long after the call ended. Kevin's infidelity had felt like a storm. Sudden, violent, devastating. But this was something else entirely. Something colder and more deliberate. Theft, fraud, corruption, words that didn't belong in the same sentence as husband, until now. I realized then I might not just be planning for divorce. I might be preparing for federal court. That night, Kevin was unusually affectionate, wrapping his arms around me from behind while I cooked. "Smells amazing," he said, kissing the side of my neck. I flinched before I could stop myself, and he pulled back just slightly. "Everything okay?" he asked. I smiled over my shoulder and lied. "Just tired." He talked through dinner about an upcoming, quote, conference in Atlanta, saying Gary wanted him to attend a panel on corporate sustainability. "Should be a good networking opportunity," Kevin said, sipping his wine like a man with nothing to hide. 2 nights, 3 tops. I nodded, already planning to search his email the moment he left the room. "You'll love Atlanta," I replied, my tone deliberately light. As soon as he went upstairs for a shower, I slipped into his study and sat at his desk. His laptop was still on, and he hadn't logged out of his email, an unusual oversight for someone normally so careful. I scrolled through his folders until I found what I needed, a hotel reservation for 2 under a fake consulting firm name. The check-in date matched his supposed conference. The name on the second line made my stomach churn. Denise Hartwell. I took another screenshot and saved it to my encrypted folder. Every lie he told became another brick in the wall I was building to trap him. Denise wasn't just a mistress, she was a co-conspirator. And if they were funneling corporate money into personal travel and gifts, they weren't just cheating on their spouses, they were stealing from Gary. I needed to find out how deep this went. The next day, I met Emma at a quiet diner halfway between our houses, away from anyone who might recognize us. She arrived with her usual energy, but her eyes were serious as she slid into the booth across from me. "Melissa, my friend from Hartwell, found something else," she said. "Kevin authorized a $25,000 payment to a shell company last week. There's no website, no LinkedIn, no presence at all." I blinked, stunned. "That's not a client expense," I said. "That's laundering." Emma nodded grimly and handed me a USB drive. It's a copy of the ledger she pulled from the internal system. But she's scared. If Kevin or Denise catches on, she could lose her job, or worse. I closed my fingers around the drive, my pulse thudding in my ears. She won't be exposed. I promised. "I'll only share this with someone I trust." Emma tilted her head, studying me. "Who could you possibly trust in this situation besides me?" My answer came the next morning when Gary Hartwell called our house looking for Kevin. "He left his phone at the office," Gary said. "I was hoping you could let him know I'm moving up our meeting about the Peterson account." I hesitated for just a second. "Of course, I'll let him know." "Angela," Gary added before hanging up, "you've always been the sharp one in the room. If you ever notice something that doesn't feel right, you can always come to me." His voice was calm, measured, almost fatherly. I thanked him and hung up slowly. My fingers tapped the countertop, one thought looping louder and louder. He already suspects something. That afternoon, I drove to Hartwell Industries under the pretense of bringing Kevin his forgotten phone. I wore my most understated outfit, soft gray blouse, slacks, no makeup beyond the bare minimum. Patricia, Gary's longtime assistant, greeted me with a polite but slightly tense smile. "Oh, Mrs. Mitchell, Kevin's not in his office right now." I nodded, glancing toward the executive wing. "Actually, I was hoping to speak with Gary." Her brows lifted slightly, but she reached for the intercom without hesitation. "Mr. Hartwell, Angela Mitchell is here to see you. Says it's important." After a pause, she nodded. "He'll see you now." I stepped through the frosted glass doors with my heart hammering inside my ribs. Gary stood when I entered, closing a thick folder on his desk. "Angela," he said warmly. "To what do I owe the visit?" I shut the door behind me and walked forward without speaking. Then, I pulled the USB from my purse and placed it on the desk between us. "I think Kevin and Denise are stealing from you," I said plainly. Gary didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the USB like it might bite him. "I have emails, receipts, hotel bookings, and now internal payment records." I waited for a reaction, but his face remained unreadable. Finally, he reached for the USB. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. "Emma's friend," I replied, choosing not to name her. "She works in accounting. She's been tracking discrepancies ever since Kevin's promotion." Gary nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I'd been watching them too," I exhaled, startled by the confirmation. "You suspected?" He leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "I've been running this company for 30 years, Angela. I may be old, but I'm not blind." He rose and walked toward the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Denise hasn't been herself for over a year. I thought it was just marriage fatigue, but then I started seeing numbers that didn't add up." He turned to face me, and I saw something raw flicker in his eyes. I needed confirmation. Now I have it. We spent the next hour comparing notes, dates, financial anomalies, and timelines that painted a damning portrait of their collaboration. Gary had already commissioned a quiet audit, but my information accelerated his timeline. "We'll move fast," he said. "If they catch wind, they'll bury everything." I nodded, my throat dry. "What do you need me to do?" "Keep pretending," Gary said. "Act like you know nothing. Let them stay comfortable." He walked me to the door and rested a hand on my shoulder. "Angela, thank you. You just saved this company." Driving home from Gary's office felt like traveling through a different world, one where nothing was quite what it seemed anymore. The buildings blurred past my window, familiar yet foreign, like the backdrop of a life I no longer belonged to. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, replaying his words over and over. Keep pretending. Let them stay comfortable. I hadn't realized how good I'd become at pretending until then. Kevin was in the kitchen when I walked in, sleeves rolled up, chopping onions for his signature bolognese. "Thought I'd cook tonight," he said, flashing that familiar crooked smile. "You've been stressed lately. Figured I'd take care of you for a change." The irony twisted like a knife in my stomach. I set my purse down and smiled, wondering if he could see the exhaustion in my eyes. "Smells amazing," I said, taking a sip from the glass of wine he handed me. He chatted about his day while I nodded at the appropriate intervals, my mind elsewhere. His version of the day was sanitized. Meetings, calls, a quick lunch with Gary. What he didn't say was what mattered most. He didn't mention the financial inconsistencies, the real reason Gary had moved up their meeting. The next few days passed in a strange, deliberate rhythm. Kevin remained cheerful, even affectionate, as though trying to anchor us to normalcy. I cooked his favorite meals, kept our calendar updated, and folded his shirts with mechanical care. But every gesture was now part of a performance, every kiss a scene in a play neither of us acknowledged. I had become fluent in this new language of deception. Emma checked in regularly, sometimes just texting a heart emoji when words felt too dangerous. "Melissa says there's talk in accounting. She told me during one of our late-night calls. No one's saying names, but there's a rumor about ghost vendors." I confirmed nothing, but we both knew who the rumors pointed toward. "Tell her to lay low," I said. "It's almost over." On Thursday, Kevin announced his weekend business trip to Atlanta with the same enthusiasm he once reserved for surprise dates. 3 days, tops, he said. I'll be back Sunday night. I raised an eyebrow but didn't push. Will Gary be there too? I asked casually. Kevin paused, just for a beat. No, just me and a couple guys from the client side. It was a sloppy answer for someone usually so precise. Kevin had grown comfortable, too comfortable. That night, I planted a small recording device in the lining of his duffel bag, courtesy of Gary's tech team. It looked like a luggage tag, but held over 24 hours of high-quality audio. My hand didn't even shake as I zipped the bag shut. When I hugged him goodbye the next morning, I lingered a moment longer than usual. Be safe, I said into his shoulder, inhaling the expensive cologne I now associated with lies. Always, he said, kissing my forehead before disappearing down the driveway. I stood at the window long after his car was gone, the silence of the house stretching into something unbearable. Then I got to work. Gary and I met at a secure location, an office building downtown owned by a holding company with no signage on the door. Inside, a conference room had been repurposed as a war room, walls lined with charts, documents, and a massive timeline of Kevin and Denise's transactions. We've traced nearly $800,000, Gary said, pointing to a folder labeled Cayman Transfers. It's all there, the vendors, the accounts, the fake invoices. I handed him the recording device, still warm from its time in Kevin's bag. Let's hope he talked, I said. Gary smiled grimly. He always does. We sat together, listening in silence to the playback. Kevin chatting with Denise about their weekend plans, about which account the next payment would funnel through, even joking about how clueless Gary still was. He still thinks I'm loyal, Kevin said on the recording, laughing softly. I swear, I could be stealing his socks, and he'd thank me for folding them. Denise's voice followed, sultry and sharp. You're a genius, baby. After this last push, we're out. Gary's jaw clenched as he fast-forwarded to the next segment. They're accelerating, he muttered. We need to strike now. Back at home, I prepared for the final act. Every movement felt deliberate. Choosing a soft blue blouse, curling my hair, setting the dining table just the way Kevin liked it. I made his favorite dinner, the one he always requested on anniversaries, rosemary chicken with lemon risotto. It wasn't our anniversary, of course, but it would be the last dinner we'd share as husband and wife. The idea made my throat tighten. Kevin returned Sunday evening, whistling as he rolled his suitcase through the front door. "Miss me?" he asked, setting down his bag. "Of course," I said, taking his coat. He noticed the smell from the kitchen and smiled. "Wow, you really went all out." We ate together like always, but I watched him more than I listened. He talked about the client he met for brunch, the, quote, late-night strategy session, all lies layered over truth like cheap wallpaper. I smiled in all the right places, asked just enough questions to seem invested. When he finished his wine, I poured him another and cleared the plates. "Dessert?" I asked sweetly. "Only if you made that chocolate tart," he teased. I brought out the tart, cut 2 slices, and handed him the larger one. He took a bite and sighed with satisfaction. This is why I married you." I smiled, though my eyes didn't. "Shame you forgot." Kevin blinked, confused. "What?" I sat across from him, folded my hands, and leaned in. "Denise says hello. She also says last night was unforgettable." He froze, fork suspended midair. "What are you talking about?" he asked, voice suddenly tight. I reached into my purse and placed my phone on the table, tapping play. Denise's voice filled the space, sensual and damning. "You left your underwear here again." Kevin paled instantly, the blood draining from his face as the recording continued. "I don't. This isn't. Where did you get that?" he stammered. I tilted my head. "You left your phone unlocked. A rookie mistake, really." His hand twitched toward the phone, but I snatched it away. "Don't bother deleting anything," I said. "It's all backed up. The emails, the bookings, the transfers. I've got it all." Kevin stared at me, finally understanding just how cornered he was. Kevin pushed his chair back from the table so fast it scraped against the hardwood floor, the sound as sharp as his breath. "Angela, you don't understand what you're playing with," he said, voice low and tight, a mask of calm stretched thin over panic. "There are things you don't know, things that could hurt you if you go any further." I stayed seated, unmoved, my hands folded neatly in my lap. "You mean like the offshore account in your name and Denise's?" I asked calmly, watching his eyes widen. "That's not what you think," he said quickly, standing now, pacing as if motion might help him think. "It was part of a plan, just a business structure for consulting fees. Tax efficient." I let him talk, watching him spiral into a pile of desperate rationalizations. "Kevin, it's wire fraud, embezzlement, laundering. Take your pick," I replied. "And you were sloppy." He ran a hand through his hair and glanced toward the front door like he wanted to bolt. "Look," he said, his voice softening as if he thought charm might still save him. "You don't need to do this. We can fix it. I'll stop seeing her." My laugh was sharp and sudden. "You think this is about Denise?" Kevin stopped pacing, confused. "What else would it be about?" he asked, genuinely baffled. "This is about the money," I said. "The company funds you funneled through fake vendors. The bank accounts in Zurich. The consulting contracts that never happened." He stared at me like I'd grown another head. "How do you know all that?" he whispered. "You wouldn't understand how that works." I stood now, walking slowly toward him with the grace of a woman who held every card in the deck. "No," I said, "but Gary does." His mouth opened, then closed again, the realization hitting like a slap. "You told Gary?" he asked, suddenly pale. "He knows," I nodded. "And he's not the only one. The forensic audit is complete. The board has everything." Kevin staggered back a step and dropped onto the edge of the couch, deflated. "He'll ruin me," he muttered. "He trusted me." My voice softened, but only slightly. "You ruined yourself, Kevin. You trusted Denise more than your own wife, and you used that trust to steal from someone who gave you everything." He didn't speak for a long time, staring down at his hands like they were unfamiliar. "They'll send me to prison," he said quietly. "Federal prison." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. His silence was its own confession. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror and stared at my reflection. The woman looking back wasn't the same one who had answered Kevin's phone 2 weeks ago. Her eyes were sharper now, her posture straighter. I tucked my hair behind one ear and fastened the pearl earrings I'd almost pawned during Kevin's lean years. Today, they felt like armor. Gary picked me up in a black sedan, his usual driver at the wheel. We didn't speak much during the ride to the Hartwell Industries headquarters. The city passed by in silence, sunlight glinting off the windows like sparks from a fire I hadn't started, but would gladly help extinguish. At the security desk, I signed in under my full name, Angela Mitchell, guest of Mr. Hartwell. Inside the boardroom, everything was already prepared. Folders lay in front of each chair, neatly stacked with tabs and summaries. A monitor glowed on the far wall, waiting for the presentation to begin. I took my seat at the far end, beside Gary, who gave me a small nod of approval. "This ends today," he said under his breath. The board members filed in slowly, most greeting each other with forced smiles and stiff handshakes. Kevin walked in last, flanked by Denise, both of them composed, but visibly tense. Denise wore a cream-colored dress too polished for a routine board meeting, her makeup a shade too perfect. Kevin avoided my gaze entirely. Good, I thought. Look at the people you betrayed instead. Gary rose first, clearing his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "This emergency session concerns serious financial irregularities we've uncovered during a recent internal audit." The room shifted as people glanced at one another, confusion blooming into concern. "We have identified multiple instances of fraudulent vendor accounts, unauthorized wire transfers, and shell corporations tied directly to members of this board and executive team." Kevin sat straighter, his jaw tight. Denise leaned forward, trying to maintain control. "Gary, maybe we should discuss this privately," she began, but Gary cut her off with a raised hand. "This is a board matter, and it will be handled with full transparency." He tapped the laptop beside him, and the monitor lit up with a timeline stretching 18 months. "Let's begin with the first transaction, shall we?" As Gary walked them through each payment, dates, amounts, fake vendor names, I watched the room change. Sympathy drained from faces like color from a photograph. Kevin's name appeared again and again on approval forms, authorization slips, invoice trails. "Each of these companies traces back to a shared account registered offshore," Gary said. "And the names on that account are Kevin Mitchell and Denise Hartwell." Gasps rippled across the room, some shocked, some disgusted. Kevin turned to Denise as if seeing her for the first time, but she was already bristling with self-preservation. "He said it was legal," she snapped. "He said it was just a tax strategy." Kevin's eyes widened. "You signed off on everything!" "Enough," Gary said, his voice like steel. "This isn't a he said, she said situation. The audit is complete. The documentation is airtight. The authorities have already been briefed." As if on cue, 2 federal agents stepped into the room. One of them addressed the group, flipping open a badge. "Kevin Mitchell, Denise Hartwell, you are under investigation for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. You are not under arrest at this moment, but you are advised not to leave the state." Denise paled visibly. Kevin slumped forward, defeated. Gary handed each of them a termination letter, their names printed in bold at the top. "Effective immediately," he said. "You are both dismissed from your positions. Security will escort you out." Kevin stood slowly, shoulders hunched, but Denise turned to Gary one last time. "You'll regret this," she said coldly. "You've made a powerful enemy." "No," Gary replied evenly. "I've removed a parasite from my company." They were led from the room in stunned silence. As the door closed behind them, Gary turned to the rest of the board. "Motion to vote Angela Mitchell as interim VP of Strategic Compliance?" Every hand rose. I sat in the silence that followed the vote, hands folded in my lap, surrounded by the board members who had once only seen me as Kevin's quiet, supportive wife. Now they addressed me with nods of respect and murmurs of approval, the weight of my new title pressing down like a medal and a burden at once. "Congratulations, Angela," one of them said, offering a handshake I accepted with calm detachment. Gary watched me with something close to admiration, though his expression was still marred by the ache of betrayal. I'd helped him expose 2 of the people closest to him, and we both knew the cost wasn't over yet. That night, I returned home to a house that no longer felt like mine. Kevin's keys were gone from the hook, his shoes missing from the foyer, his presence erased with surgical precision. I walked through the room slowly, turning off lights one by one, as if tucking a child into bed. In our bedroom, his drawers were half empty, but his cologne still clung to the air like smoke after a fire. "I didn't cry," Emma called around 9, her voice hesitant. "I saw the news," she said. "It's everywhere. Local, national, even one of the business podcasts I follow." I closed the blinds in the kitchen, shielding myself from the cameras I knew would be parked on the street by morning. "It's only just started," I said. "People are going to want blood now." "They already do," she replied. "But they're also talking about you, how brave you were, how you stood by Gary and helped take them down." I gave a soft laugh that didn't reach my chest. "They weren't there when I was shaking so badly I dropped my keys in the lobby. They didn't hear Kevin call me, naive, the night he realized I knew everything." Emma was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. I looked around the darkened kitchen, eyes landing on the empty wine glass from dinner. "I don't know," I admitted. "I think I will be, but not yet." The next morning brought headlines that made my skin prickle. CEO's wife and VP caught in $2.3 million embezzlement scandal. Betrayed spouses helped expose elaborate financial scheme. My face appeared in several of the photos, sometimes arriving at Hartwell, sometimes seated beside Gary at company events, all now recontextualized with new meaning. Friends texted condolences and congratulations in the same breath, their words soaked with curiosity. I responded to none of them. Gary called just before noon. "Denise tried to call me this morning," he said, "from her attorney's office. I didn't ask what she wanted. Apology or negotiation, it didn't matter. Let the lawyers handle it," I said. She made her choices. The following days were consumed by logistics, signing documents, attending transition meetings, sitting in interviews to clarify the chain of fraud that had slithered through the company's financial system. I wore blazers now, tailored and precise, and kept my voice low and steady in every room I entered. The woman I'd been 3 weeks ago, the one who baked scones and arranged Kevin's ties by color, was gone. In her place stood someone sharpened by betrayal. Someone who'd learned how to make a weapon out of silence. Gary took me aside after one particularly grueling day of meetings. "You're good at this," he said. "Too good to be temporary." I met his gaze and read what he wasn't saying out loud. "We'll see," I replied. "Let's get through the investigation first." At home, I set up a new office in the guest bedroom, converting the space Kevin used to call his reading room into my war room. I kept folders of evidence, backup, flash drives, and legal correspondence in organized stacks, labeling them like battlefield maps. I still slept in our bedroom, but only on my side. Kevin hadn't asked to come back. Not that I would have let him. His absence was a relief I hadn't expected. Emma came by one evening with dinner and 2 bottles of wine. "You look taller," she said, setting the takeout on the kitchen counter. "Like you're made of marble now instead of nerves." I smiled, grateful for her presence even as I felt slightly disconnected from it. "I feel like I'm standing outside my own skin," I admitted. "Like I borrowed someone stronger and she hasn't noticed yet." We sat on the porch with our glasses, the cicadas buzzing in the distance. "Have you heard from Kevin?" she asked. "Not directly," I replied. "His lawyers sent a request for partial asset release." "Denied, of course." Emma exhaled sharply. "God, what a coward!" I nodded slowly. "I think the part that hurts the most is how long he was willing to look me in the eye and lie. Not just about Denise, but about everything. Money, business, us." I turned my glass in my hands. "I don't know how you fake a life that completely." Emma reached over and squeezed my knee. "You didn't fake it," she said. "You lived it. He just opted out somewhere along the way." Her words hit something soft and sore inside me. I let them sit between us, like a stone we didn't need to carry just yet. The next morning brought an official letter from the district attorney's office confirming that formal charges had been filed against both Kevin and Denise. Wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, each word landed like a gavel strike in my chest. I stared at the pages and thought about how many lies it took to build a crime like that. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Melissa, Emma's friend in accounting. "I just wanted to thank you," she said. "You have no idea how many of us were afraid to speak up." I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the garden I used to tend every weekend. I was afraid too, I admitted. But fear stops meaning much once you know the truth. "Are you going to stay on at Hartwell?" she asked. I hesitated. "I don't know yet. There's still a lot to clean up, but I'm not hiding anymore." She paused, then said, "We're all rooting for you, Angela, just so you know." I hung up and sat in the silence, the weight of her words sinking in. Rooting for me. It felt strange to be seen after so many years of being someone else's background. I pressed my hand against the desk, grounding myself. And I realized I wasn't standing outside my skin anymore. The following week passed in quiet efficiency as legal proceedings ramped up and the press circus slowly simmered down. Kevin and Denise had both made bail, but their names now existed as punchlines in headlines and cautionary tales in business ethics courses. I saw photos of them online, Kevin leaving court in a wrinkled suit, Denise shielding her face with oversized sunglasses. They looked like ghosts of the glamorous power couple they'd pretended to be. I saved none of the articles. Inside Hartwell Industries, I learned more about corporate betrayal than I ever cared to know. Gary and I reviewed files together in silence, sometimes speaking in short bursts of strategy, other times not at all. Our alliance had turned into a partnership, bound not by trust, but by the shared devastation of betrayal. "They hollowed out everything we built," Gary said one morning, flipping through another set of doctored invoices, and smiled while doing it. I didn't tell him that I still had dreams about it. Whispers in the dark. Denise's voice merging with Kevin's laughter while money disappeared into nothing. I'd wake up sweating, gasping, gripping the sheets like they were the only thing anchoring me. Even asleep, my body remembered the sting of humiliation, the raw edge of disbelief. Therapy seemed like a logical step, but I couldn't stomach the idea of sharing this story with someone paid to listen. Not yet. Emma called from a bookstore one afternoon, asking if I wanted her to pick up anything new to read. "Something empowering?" she offered. "Or maybe scandalous?" I chuckled. "How about something with a clean ending?" I said. "No twists, no betrayal, just justice." Gary's legal team sent me regular updates, each one detailing Kevin and Denise's mounting charges. Their lawyers were attempting a damage control strategy, plea deals, reduced sentences, arguments of ignorance and manipulation. But the paper trail was too precise, too damning, too intricate for innocence. Every line item was a nail in the coffin of their defense. And I had personally handed Gary the hammer. One evening I returned home to find an envelope wedged into the side of my mailbox. No postage, no return address, just my name, written in Kevin's familiar handwriting. I took it inside, held it under the kitchen light for several minutes before opening it. Inside was a letter, handwritten in blue ink, folded once. I unfolded it with steady hands. "Angela, Hebelidol, I know you won't believe anything I say, and you shouldn't, but I need you to know that I never meant to hurt you, not like this. I was weak, and Denise saw it and used it. By the time I realized what was happening, it had gone too far. You were the best part of my life, and I destroyed it." I set the letter down and stared at the wall, not because I believed it, but because it was the first time he'd said something that sounded even remotely real. Not a defense, not a deflection, just an admission. The rest of the letter rambled, regret, nostalgia, what-ifs, but it ended on a note that made my breath catch. "I hope someday you'll remember who we were before I became this." I folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. Then I placed it in the drawer beside the printed spreadsheets of his crimes. That weekend, I attended a private strategy meeting with Gary and several senior executives to discuss restructuring. The company had weathered the press, but confidence had taken a hit. "We need to rebuild the brand," one of the executives said. "Remind people we're more than the scandal." Gary turned to me and asked, "Would you consider taking a more permanent role?" The room went quiet, all eyes suddenly on me. "I never saw myself in corporate leadership," I admitted. "But then again, I never saw myself bringing down a multi-million-dollar fraud ring either." There were a few chuckles, tension easing slightly. "Let's rebuild it right this time," I added. Gary nodded. From the inside out. The announcement went out Monday. I had accepted the position of Vice President of Strategic Compliance and Internal Integrity, a title that made me both respected and feared. I didn't relish the fear, but I understood it now. People were watching me closely, curious to see if the betrayed wife would turn into a vengeful executive. I had no interest in revenge anymore, just precision. Later that night, Emma brought over dinner again, her arms full of containers and her eyes bright with mischief. "So," she said, flopping onto the couch, "you're basically Olivia Pope now." I raised an eyebrow. "Without the designer coats or ethically questionable client list." She laughed, pouring us wine. "You know Dad would have been proud of you, right?" The mention of our father hit me unexpectedly hard. The grief fresh in a way it hadn't been in years. He'd taught us both about integrity, about earning what we kept, about standing firm when the ground shifted. "I hope so," I said quietly, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I really do." The next day I got a call from Patricia, Gary's longtime assistant. "Kevin tried to access his old login credentials this morning," she said. "IT flagged it immediately. He didn't get in, but thought you should know." I sighed, the weight of vigilance settling in again. "Thanks, Patricia. Keep monitoring. Anything suspicious, Report it directly to me. I stared out the window after that call, watching wind ripple through the trees in our backyard. I'd spent years keeping that space perfect, mulching the flower beds, pruning the lavender, painting the fence every other summer. Now it looked wild and overgrown, and I didn't hate it. Some things I realized didn't need to be managed to be beautiful. Kevin's trial date was set for the following month, and Denise's was scheduled for shortly after. The state was seeking the maximum sentence for both. 15 years for Kevin, 12 for Denise. Their assets were frozen, their reputations annihilated, their names spoken in hushed tones at events they used to headline. Emma once asked me if I felt vindicated. The truth was, I didn't feel much at all. I felt steady, mostly. Not good, not bad, just still. It was as close to peace as I'd come since the phone call that changed everything. And I was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was enough. On the morning of Kevin's trial, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, smoothing down the collar of my charcoal blazer. My pearl earrings glinted under the soft bathroom light, a quiet reminder of who I had been before all of this began. The woman staring back at me didn't look angry or triumphant, just composed. That was what I needed to be today. Composed, unshakable, untouchable. The courthouse loomed in my windshield 20 minutes later. Old stone wrapped in ivy like it had grown tired of standing guard over other people's truths. I met Gary on the courthouse steps, both of us dressed like we were attending a business meeting instead of the public dismantling of our former lives. "You ready?" he asked, adjusting his cufflinks without looking at me. "I've been ready since Denise whispered into my husband's phone," I said. Gary gave a quiet, bitter chuckle, the kind that belonged to someone who'd stopped expecting justice and started making it happen. We walked inside side by side, not allies or friends, but survivors of the same wreckage. Kevin sat at the defendant's table, flanked by two attorneys in navy suits that couldn't hide the unease on their faces. He looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders hunched, jaw tight, hair slightly overgrown at the edges like he hadn't bothered to care. For a moment his eyes flicked toward me. I held his gaze, not with hate, but with the empty finality of someone who had long since closed the book. He looked away first. The prosecution opened with precision, laying out Kevin's crimes with a clarity that left no room for doubt or misinterpretation. Every transaction, every fake invoice, every late-night wire transfer from Hartwell Industries was displayed on the courtroom monitor in painstaking order. I watched as Kevin's digital fingerprints unfolded before the judge. Months of deception turned into a chain of evidence that wrapped tighter with every passing minute. His lawyers barely interrupted, because there was nothing to argue. The truth was louder than any defense. The courtroom wasn't full, just a handful of reporters, a few curious employees from Hartwell, and one woman I didn't recognize sitting alone in the back, silently crying. Emma had offered to come, but I told her no. I needed to do this part alone. This wasn't about family anymore. It was about finishing what I had started. Kevin's betrayal didn't just hurt me. It had hurt people who trusted him, worked with him, built things alongside him. By mid-afternoon, the prosecution called its final witness, a forensic accountant who had traced over $2.3 million through Kevin's web of shell companies. The courtroom remained quiet as she testified, each figure a hammer blow. I listened, stone-faced, as she described how Kevin had used company resources to pay for lavish trips, luxury gifts, and a romantic lifestyle with Denise that I had unknowingly subsidized. When they mentioned the boutique hotel in Charleston, I thought of the receipt I had found tucked in his gym bag and how I'd stared at it for an hour before accepting what it meant. Denise wasn't just a symptom, she'd been a partner in the crime. When the court recessed for a short break, I stepped outside and sat on the cold stone bench near the courthouse doors. I needed air, space, something that didn't smell like wood polish and past lies. My phone buzzed with a message from Emma. "Thinking of you. He doesn't get to win." I didn't reply, but her words wrapped around my ribs like armor. The wind blew a strand of hair across my face, and I didn't bother to move it. Back inside, Kevin's lawyers attempted a watered-down closing argument, painting him as manipulated, emotionally unstable, led astray by a woman who preyed on his professional insecurities. It was almost laughable. Kevin had always been arrogant, not fragile. The judge didn't seem swayed. He asked pointed questions about signatures, account access, and travel records, all of which Kevin had authorized himself. It was clear the court didn't see him as a victim. As the day drew to a close, the judge postponed the sentencing to allow final review of restitution claims. Kevin would spend at least a night in holding, and possibly much longer depending on pending federal charges. He was led out of the courtroom without handcuffs, but surrounded by guards. Our eyes met again as he passed me in the aisle. This time, I didn't blink. Outside, Gary waited near the steps again, phone in hand, already scanning emails about Denise's upcoming trial. "You did well in there," he said, not as a compliment, but as a statement of fact. "He won't get away with any of it." I nodded, wrapping my coat tighter around me as the wind picked up. "Now it's her turn," I replied. The following week passed in a strange rhythm. Office meetings, quiet nights, the occasional awkward congratulations from colleagues who didn't know whether to pity me or admire me. I buried myself in compliance audits, HR reviews, and restructuring plans. Every day I stepped into Kevin's former office, I made it mine a little more, replacing furniture, clearing files, rewriting the energy. The corner view of the skyline no longer reminded me of betrayal. It reminded me of what was still standing. Denise's trial was smaller, more focused, fewer financial records, more emphasis on her role as an insider and her betrayal of Gary's trust. She arrived in court with a fresh blowout, red lipstick, and a 1,000-yard stare. She didn't look at me, not once. Her lawyer argued diminished capacity and marital strain, attempting to pivot her narrative toward loneliness and exploitation. But the paper trail said otherwise. The judge reviewed messages between her and Kevin, strategizing, mocking Gary, celebrating transfers like milestones in a twisted love story. "Just moved, the last batch," one message read, "feels like our own little heist." I watched Gary's shoulders tighten with each word. Denise never flinched, even when the judge addressed her directly. "You didn't just break vows," he said. "You broke systems." At the end of the week, both Kevin and Denise were found guilty on all counts. The judge's gavel struck like punctuation at the end of a sentence I had been writing since the day I picked up Kevin's phone. They were remanded into custody pending final sentencing. Denise looked stunned for the first time since the scandal broke. Kevin, seated a few rows behind her, finally bowed his head. When I returned home that night, I found another envelope in the mailbox, smaller than the first. No handwriting this time. Inside was a typed note with no signature. "You won, Angela, but be careful who watches you now." I stood there on the porch, reading those words as the wind pulled at the trees. I didn't know who sent it or what it meant, but I knew this story wasn't finished. I read the anonymous note 3 times before stepping back into the house, locking the door behind me and checking the windows without even thinking. The paper was thin, cheap, printed on a standard office printer. No return address, no watermark, no indication of who had written it or why. "You won, Angela. But be careful who watches you now." The words weren't a threat, not exactly, but they weren't a peace offering either. They were something else. Unfinished business dressed as a warning. I didn't show the note to Gary right away, and I didn't tell Emma. Instead, I slipped it into a folder labeled Post-Trial Correspondence and placed it in the locked cabinet beside my desk at Hartwell. If it meant something, it would eventually show its hand. If it didn't, I'd already learned not to chase shadows unless they stepped into the light. I wasn't the kind of woman anymore who mistook smoke for fire. The days following the trial settled into something resembling quiet, but not quite peace. The media had turned their attention to newer scandals, flashier crimes, younger faces. Kevin and Denise had become footnotes, cautionary tales taught in ethics seminars and whispered about in back rooms of corporate mixers. Their sentencing was scheduled for mid-May, and both had been denied bail after new evidence surfaced of additional offshore accounts. I wasn't surprised. Kevin tried to reach out again, this time through his attorney, a formal letter, filled with legal phrases and requests for cooperation in dividing assets. I passed it to my own lawyer, without reading past the salutation. We'd already frozen the accounts, And with the fraud restitution claims in process, there wasn't much left to fight over. He could argue for a house he no longer lived in, but he'd already abandoned everything that made it home. I received a separate notice from the Department of Justice outlining the federal restitution structure. Over the next 10 years, Kevin and Denise would be required to pay back every cent they stole, with interest. The accounts they used to fund luxury vacations would now fund the slow, public rebuilding of what they tried to destroy. Ironically, their monthly repayments would be wired directly into Hartwell's compliance division, the one I now oversaw. I printed the letter and pinned it inside my office drawer like a trophy. One morning in early April, Gary and I walked the halls of Hartwell's headquarters together, quietly observing employees returning to a rhythm that had once been broken. "They're steadier now," I said. "We all are," Gary replied. "Scars don't make you weaker. They remind you of what not to ignore next time." I nodded, though I couldn't help thinking some wounds still bled on the inside, even when the surface looked calm. After everything, Gary had decided not to file for divorce just yet. He said he needed time, not to forgive, but to sort through what Denise had done to his view of love, loyalty, and legacy. I understood that in ways I hadn't expected. My divorce had been clean on paper but complicated in soul. Some days, I felt like I had walked away without a single bruise. Other days, the bruises bloomed behind my ribs where no one could see. Emma invited me to a weekend retreat in Vermont, just us, the woods, and no phones. "You need a reset," she said. "You've been in survival mode for too long." I agreed, even though part of me was afraid to stop moving. Stillness made room for memory, and I wasn't sure I wanted to remember everything. The cabin was modest, tucked beneath a canopy of pine and maple trees, the air still crisp with the tail end of winter. We played cards, cooked simple meals, and walked along trails where the snow hadn't fully melted yet. One night, beside the fireplace, Emma said, "You never told me what you'd do if they got out early." I looked at her for a long time, the flames reflecting in her eyes. "Then I'll be ready," I said simply. When I returned to the city, the final sentencing had been issued. Kevin received 16 years, with eligibility for parole after 12, conditional on full restitution and cooperation. Denise received 13 years. Her cooperation during the investigation had earned her leniency, but not mercy. Neither one had spoken at their hearing. The judge's final statement had echoed in every article. Greed isn't an accident. It's a choice repeated until the mask finally cracks. I went back to work the next day, stopping at the cafe downstairs to get the same latte I'd ordered every Monday morning for years. The barista smiled at me differently now, recognition with a hint of reverence. "You're the woman from the article, right?" she asked. "The one who exposed everything?" I nodded once. "I'm the woman who answered the wrong phone call." The rest of the year passed in quiet strides. Promotions came. I declined interviews. Invitations arrived. I ignored most of them. Emma teased me about becoming the ghost in the boardroom. Powerful, but barely seen. One afternoon, Melissa from accounting knocked on my office door. "You've got a visitor downstairs," she said. "Didn't give a name, says it's personal." I frowned. I wasn't expecting anyone. "Send them up," I replied, already bracing. The door opened 5 minutes later, revealing a woman I didn't recognize. Mid-30s, dark blazer, no makeup, and eyes that held too much knowledge. "Angela Mitchell," she asked, her voice even. "I'm with Financial Crimes Enforcement. May I speak with you privately?" I gestured for her to sit, every muscle in my body going still. "Is this about Kevin?" I asked. "No," she said, folding her hands on her lap. "It's about something he left behind." She placed a sealed folder on my desk. The label read, "Asset Trail, Zurich Account Extension." My fingers hesitated at the edge. "We believe there are other names involved," she said. "People Kevin did business with before Hartwell, possibly laundering through different firms." My chest tightened. "You think it's still happening?" She didn't blink. "We think someone picked up where he left off." After she left, I sat in the dimming light of my office, folder unopened, thoughts spinning like a storm, barely restrained by calm. I had walked through fire and come out stronger. But what if the flames hadn't gone out? What if this was just the next chapter in a story that hadn't finished with courtrooms and headlines? I looked out over the city, its lights beginning to flicker on as dusk approached. And I realized that surviving was never the end. It was only the beginning of staying one step ahead. Thank you for listening to Angela's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.